Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. When a woman disappears without a trace, most people expect signs of struggle, a broken window, a scream. But sometimes, the silence is more terrifying. Tuesday, March 4th, 2025. Titusville, Florida. At 11:42 a.m., a concerned friend called 911 to report a 72-year-old woman missing from her apartment at the Palmetto Arms complex. Her name was Jesse Kirk. A former nurse, widow, and longtime Brevard County resident, Jesse was known to neighbors as consistent, precise, and deeply private. That morning, she never showed up for her regular walk. The reporting party was firm. Jesse doesn't miss appointments, ever. When responding officers arrived at the unit, they found the front door locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Her phone was on the kitchen table, her prescription medication lined up on the counter. Her purse remained untouched. There were no dishes in the sink, no laundry in the machine, no note left behind. But one thing stood out immediately. Her keys were missing, and so was her 2018 silver Honda CR-V. Investigators from the Titusville Police Department initiated a welfare check and entered the apartment. No blood, no overturned furniture, no phone calls made that morning from either her landline or her cell. No browser activity on her laptop since the night before. By 1:09 p.m., less than 2 hours after Jesse was first reported missing, Orange County Fire Rescue responded to a vehicle fire near the intersection of State Road 50 and State Road 520. A remote stretch just west of the St. Johns River Basin. The vehicle, a silver SUV, was fully engulfed in flames when units arrived. License plate confirmation returned to Jesse Kirk. This escalation triggered a full-scale missing persons case. Detectives arrived on scene within the hour. The SUV was burned beyond recovery. No body was found inside, no blood, no obvious DNA. But forensic analysts noted accelerant patterns near the driver's side wheel well and a melted zip tie partially fused into the floorboard carpeting in the back seat. More concerning, aerial drones used in the fire zone perimeter revealed tire drag marks veering off the road toward a wooded trailhead near the Haulover Canal, a wildlife corridor used mostly by boaters and fishermen. That's where search crews around 2:45 p.m. found something that shifted the case from disappearance to probable homicide. Roughly 40 yards into the woods, in a sand depression bordered by pine and saw palmetto, lay human remains, burned, curled inward, almost skeletal. Wrapped in partially melted plastic sheeting and secured with 2 additional zip ties, medical examiners transported the remains to the District 18 Forensic Unit in Orlando. Preliminary indicators suggested the victim was female, elderly, and subjected to thermal exposure consistent with accelerant use. Dental records were pulled from Jesse's known dentist that evening for expedited comparison. Back in Titusville, neighbors reported they hadn't seen Jesse leave the complex that morning. No surveillance footage showed her exiting. The parking lot camera, poorly angled and outdated, only showed the CR-V driving away at 8:03 a.m., but not who was driving. Investigators noted Jesse was 5'4", 118 pounds, with limited mobility due to chronic arthritis. She was not capable of lifting gas canisters, nor walking long distances unassisted, yet her car was driven over 20 miles, torched, and she was likely relocated again to a secondary disposal site. That fact alone eliminated the possibility of this being an accidental death or self-harm. If Jesse didn't drive herself there, then who did? Detective Karen Silvers, the lead on the case, made a quiet observation during that first briefing. There's no struggle, no scream, just silence, and someone who knew her schedule well enough to intercept. Within 24 hours, the case shifted focus to possible abduction and premeditated murder. Crime scene technicians returned to the fire site for secondary evidence sweeps. Forensic imaging teams scanned the area for residual traces, chemical accelerant mapping, ash patterns, and shoe impressions. What they found wasn't much, but it was deliberate. Gasoline-soaked pine straw, a broken piece of red plastic, possibly from a gas can, a gloved fingerprint on the hood release, smudged but salvageable. Every move pointed to control, precision, and knowledge of the area. This wasn't random. Titusville hadn't recorded a homicide since 2022. Now it had a case with an elderly woman, a burned-out vehicle, and no immediate suspect. No known enemies, no break-ins, no obvious motive. The department's record search showed one notable flag. Back in July 2024, a restraining order had been filed involving a man connected to Jesse's extended family. But as of March 4th, there was no sign that man had re-entered her life. Still, as one investigator noted, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In towns like Titusville, crime doesn't usually scream. It whispers beneath routine, behind familiarity, and sometimes it rides in silence in the back of your own car. March 5th, 2025. One day after Jesse Kirk was reported missing, the Brevard County Medical Examiner's Office began a preliminary analysis on the remains discovered near Hallover Canal. The body had been burned past recognition. Standard visual ID was not an option. The remains were wrapped in what was left of melted polyethylene, likely painter's sheeting based on chemical residue. 2 commercial-grade zip ties were found intact, used to bind the wrists. No clothing, jewelry, or personal identifiers were recovered. The surrounding soil showed clear signs of accelerant seepage. Gasoline had been poured directly onto the body before ignition. Burn pattern analysis showed the fire had been intentionally set from the feet up, with the highest concentration of thermal damage around the head and torso. The medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Hart, prioritized dental comparison. Within 24 hours, Jesse's dentist from Cocoa provided full dental records. Despite damage to the jaw structure, 3 molars remained intact. Positive match confirmed by 2:30 p.m. March 5th, the victim was officially identified as Jesse Kirk. Autopsy revealed fractured hyoid bone and compression trauma consistent with strangulation. No blunt force injuries, no defensive wounds, no ligature marks on the ankles, but wrists showed pre-mortem restraint abrasions, tight, circular, and consistent with 14-inch zip ties. Toxicology results were inconclusive due to tissue degradation from the fire. However, there were no internal injuries to suggest a physical struggle. Meanwhile, a forensic sweep of the wooded disposal site was underway. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, deployed luminol reagents and heat-mapping drones to analyze trace activity. They located partial boot impressions 10 feet northeast of the body. Size 11, deep heel strike, no matching tread pattern in any local or state law enforcement databases. Investigators also recovered a partially melted plastic tag near the southern tree line, later identified as a barcode fragment from a 1-gallon gasoline container sold exclusively at a local Walmart. Transaction records would become crucial later in the timeline. Detectives returned to the fire scene near SR 50 to conduct a secondary assessment. Burn radius confirmed use of accelerant, consistent with earlier findings at the body site. What stood out during this visit was the abnormal absence of any trace biological material inside the vehicle. The interior had been gutted, but there were no obvious signs of bleeding, hair, or tissue. Not even trace DNA on the steering wheel or gear shift. CSI flagged this anomaly. The car had not simply burned. It had been wiped clean before ignition. Fire damage would normally obscure such cleaning efforts, but forensic vacuum filters recovered microfiber residues and 2 fibers coated in bleach compound. That detail narrowed the narrative. This wasn't panic. This was execution with post-cleaning. The vehicle had been used, possibly for transport, then it was cleaned, staged, and burned. Detective Karen Silvers made a note in her report. The body wasn't dumped and burned to hide identity. It was done to erase the timeline. For the team, the focus shifted to reconstructing Jesse's last known movements. Timeline establishment was critical. A subpoena for her cell phone records had been issued March 4th. When returned, the data revealed Jesse's phone had pinged its home tower at 7:52 a.m., then went dark. No movement, no travel pings, which meant the phone had stayed home. Her vehicle, however, was last seen exiting the complex at 8:03 a.m. A forensic disconnect emerged. The vehicle moved. The victim didn't. That wasn't just coincidence, it was premeditation. Investigators requested access to license plate readers, LPRs, and traffic camera logs along all major routes between Titusville and the burn site. By March 6th, analysts confirmed the SUV had been captured by LPR at mile marker 68 westbound at 8:31 a.m. and again near Canaveral Groves at 8:44 a.m. Based on timestamps and directionality, the driver had followed a direct and intentional route. There were no wrong turns, no signs of hesitation. Whoever was behind the wheel knew where they were going. In towns like Titusville, murders aren't just crimes. They rupture the structure of routine. They don't just kill a person. They sever the community's idea of safety. Jesse Kirk had lived in the same apartment for over a decade. She never changed her schedule. She walked the same dog, drank the same coffee, greeted the same neighbors. In the end, it was her predictability that made her vulnerable. FDLE brought in behavioral analysts to begin building a profile. A quote from their early notes read, "This wasn't opportunistic, this was target-specific. The victim's lifestyle was studied. Her exit was orchestrated. Across 2 counties, 2 crime scenes now sat on record. The vehicle site near SR 50 and the body site near Hallover Canal, both chosen, both isolated, and both cleaned with methodical precision. But the most important discovery came not from forensics but from logistics. Jesse's physical condition, according to her medical file, included severe arthritis and minor neuropathy in both legs. She couldn't have walked to her car alone that morning. She couldn't have driven over 20 miles without stopping for her medication. She hadn't used her inhaler. That ruled out any chance of voluntary disappearance. There was no struggle at the home, no forced entry. And yet a woman disappeared, was killed, transported, and burned, all within a 2-hour window. The question was no longer whether a homicide had occurred. It was, who knew her well enough to do it without leaving a trace? March 6, 2025. By the 3rd day of the investigation, law enforcement had 2 crime scenes, a positive ID on the victim, and mounting forensic data pointing toward calculated, premeditated action. What they didn't yet have was a suspect. That changed by 12:07 p.m. A patrol unit in Titusville was dispatched to the Palmetto Arms Complex, Jesse Kirk's neighborhood, after a resident reported a man loitering near the property's rear fence line. The caller noted the individual seemed to be watching the building, avoiding direct paths and pacing in short, erratic bursts. When officers made contact, the man gave his name as David Barber, age 35. He had visible burns on the back of both hands, a ripped jacket sleeve, and smelled faintly of accelerant. He was detained for questioning. Barber had no identification on him. In his backpack, officers recovered a partially melted disposable lighter, 2 unused zip ties, a length of nylon rope, and a Walmart receipt dated March 3rd, less than 24 hours before Jesse's disappearance. The receipt listed the purchase of gloves, a gas can, and plastic sheeting. At that point, Barber was held under suspicion of trespassing and potential evidence tampering. While he was not under arrest for homicide, the nature of his injuries and his presence near the victim's home warranted escalation. During processing, investigators conducted a visual sweep of Barber's forearms. There were 2 small, round blisters on his left wrist and soot traces along his cuff line. Photographs were taken. A search warrant was prepared for his last known residence, a low-income rental in Cocoa. What made the case shift dramatically wasn't just the burns, it was the link to a restraining order filed in July 2024 by a woman named Emily Kirk, Jesse's niece. The complaint, filed in Brevard County Family Court, listed Barber as a former partner who had engaged in stalking, unauthorized surveillance, and intimidation. Jesse Kirk was named in the petition as a household member under indirect threat. That record connected Barber to the victim's extended family and legally documented his history of proximity-based harassment. Investigators requested all prior 911 call logs involving Barber. A disturbing trend emerged. Between August and December 2024, 3 separate reports had been filed alleging that Barber had been seen parked near Emily's workplace and once behind Jesse's apartment complex. No charges were filed at the time due to lack of direct contact. Detectives brought in Emily Kirk for a voluntary interview. Her testimony was consistent with court filings. She hadn't spoken to Barber in over 6 months. He'd sent unwanted emails, appeared at places she hadn't shared publicly, and once left a note referencing Jesse directly. "She'll get what's coming too." FDLE flagged that phrase. Barber was officially listed as a person of interest. Surveillance footage was pulled from Walmart stores in Titusville and Cocoa for March 2nd through 4th. On March 3rd at 9:21 p.m., Barber was captured on security footage purchasing a plastic tarp, zip ties, and gloves at the Garden Street location, matching items recovered in his backpack and consistent with forensic findings at both crime scenes. Digital forensics analysts reviewed the GPS metadata from Barber's cell phone. The data indicated he had traveled from his apartment to Jesse Kirk's neighborhood at approximately 7:48 a.m. on March 4th, stayed in the vicinity for 14 minutes, then moved westbound on SR 50 toward the site where Jesse's SUV was later found burning. That timestamp was corroborated by license plate reader data showing Jesse's SUV exiting the neighborhood at 8:03 a.m., but her phone never left home. The sequence further narrowed the margin of error. Barber did not offer any explanation when questioned. He requested legal counsel and remained silent during the formal interview. The fact that he had not yet been charged for murder meant he retained the right to decline forensic testing at this stage. A judge would later approve an emergency order to collect DNA. The investigative team met that evening for a full case review. The current board included positive ID on victim, Jesse Kirk. Time of disappearance between 7:52, 8:03 a.m., March 4th. Last phone activity, home location, vehicle recovery time, 1:09 p.m., March 4th. Body recovery time, 2:45 p.m., March 4th. Person of interest, David Barber. Prior connection, documented restraining order and threats, matching purchases, Walmart receipt and security footage. Physical injuries, consistent with exposure to flame. Digital data, GPS placing, Barber in proximity to all locations within time frame. Detective Silvers noted the logistical alignment. But she also voiced caution. The data lines up too perfectly. Either we're dealing with a sequence of coincidences or someone who rehearsed this. One final angle emerged that night: Barber's internet search history. After executing a court-authorized device scan, analysts discovered a series of troubling queries made in the week leading up to Jesse's disappearance. These included how to zip tie someone without bruising, how long does it take to burn a body completely, how to wipe DNA from car interior, strangulation versus suffocation signs autopsy. Those search terms, coupled with behavioral history and physical evidence, pushed the case from circumstantial to increasingly prosecutable. What this chapter of the investigation revealed wasn't just who might have had means and opportunity. It highlighted how patterns of control, once dismissed as minor threats, could escalate into irreversible outcomes. And in cases like Jesse Kirk's, where there was no gun, no blood at the scene, and no witnesses, digital and forensic footprints became the only voice left behind. On March 7, 2025, the investigation into the death of Jesse Kirk moved from circumstantial to confirmatory. What investigators recovered that day was not a confession. It was a written sequence, hand-dated, organized, and itemized, documenting each phase of what appeared to be a pre-planned abduction and execution. It was found inside a small gray notebook, wrapped in a weathered t-shirt and stuffed into a toolbox under the bathroom sink at David Barber's Cocoa residence. The warrant had been issued 18 hours earlier, following the discovery of GPS evidence and surveillance receipts that placed Barber at all relevant locations in Jesse Kirk's final hours. What the task force expected to find were digital backups, maybe emails, or deleted phone logs. What they found instead was analog, handwritten, and deeply disturbing. The first page was labeled Operation Tuesday Morning. The next line read, "Finalize all steps before 2:27. Do not adjust once initiated." The notebook contained 31 bullet points, each written in all caps, using black gel pen. They were numbered but not dated, and each entry had a box drawn beside it, most of which had been checked off in thick strokes. Among the items, survey PA, complex, 2x day, from vehicle, monitor walk start time, acquire gloves, wrap, fasteners, 2x clean shirts, burner phone. Park second vehicle near Haulover 6:30 a.m. 2s. Disable mobile, do not bring to sight. Subdue immediately. Secure mouth, zip wrists plus ankles. Do not talk to her. Limit visible contact. Fast, efficient transport. Start fire from rear wheel, back passenger first. Strip items. No personal effects left behind. Burn all notes post-task. Most items had been checked off, with a few notations in the margins, including reminders about timing, no more than 7 minutes in, out of pickup zone, and do not leave tire marks at burn site, use old boots. FDLE forensic handwriting analysts later confirmed that the handwriting matched multiple documents previously signed by Barber during his 2022 resignation from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office. The language used, abbreviated, tactical, avoidant of emotion, mirrored departmental incident reports and shift debrief notes from his prior employment. For investigators, this wasn't just chilling, it was instructive. It outlined a rigid operational mindset, a structure rooted not in chaos or emotional rage, but control, The manifesto, as it would later be dubbed in court, offered insight into Barber's planning window. The earliest planning date mentioned was February 27th. That gave him a lead time of at least 6 days before March 4th, the day Jesse Kirk was last seen. Investigators compared that date with his Walmart purchases. Receipts showed multiple itemized trips between March 1st. Surveillance confirmed solo presence, hoodie up, gloves worn. Items matched those listed in the manifesto: polyethylene sheeting, bleach-based wipes, rope, 2 gallons of gasoline in portable containers. The evidence wasn't symbolic, it was forensic. Technicians scanned the notebook for latent prints. Results returned with 3 usable right thumb partials and 2 index finger smudges, all matched to Barber via confirmed biometric records from his time in corrections. There was no trace of any secondary DNA, nor any evidence suggesting someone else had handled the notebook. What stood out to behavioral profilers was the line, "Do not talk to her." This instruction indicated preemptive emotional detachment. It was not an act of anger in the moment. It was the product of intent and calculated avoidance. Further review of his browser history revealed an interesting link. One of Barber's saved tabs was a PDF document from a tactical training manual used in corrections certification courses, specifically a chapter on transport control procedures. Verbatim phrases from that manual were mirrored in his handwritten list. While FDLE continued to catalog evidence, Brevard County prosecutors held an internal strategy meeting. The cumulative forensic record now included a written plan of action, purchases matching the tools used in the crime, physical proximity through GPS and surveillance, a past pattern of stalking, formalized through restraining order, silence during interviews, and refusal of explanation. At 6:10 p.m. March 7, 2025, the state attorney's office filed an upgraded motion to charge David Barber with first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, abuse of a dead human body, tampering with physical evidence, and grand theft auto. The checklist wasn't a confession, but it operated as the next best thing. It showed sequence, mindset, and intent. It drew the line between suspicion and strategic premeditation. In Florida, the presence of a written murder plan, executed point by point, meets the threshold for seeking the death penalty. Prosecutors knew that. The defense would know it too. Cases like this don't just hinge on what happened. They hinge on what was intended, and when that intent can be documented in the suspect's own handwriting without ambiguity, the legal threshold rises from reasonable suspicion to irrefutable orchestration. In quiet neighborhoods like Titusville, it's easy to believe evil is loud, but sometimes it's written with bullet points in neat black ink. By March 9, 2025, the forensic case against David Barber had reached a critical mass. The notebook had given prosecutors structure, but what came next, what didn't appear on his checklist, would prove just as damaging. The autopsy report on Jesse Kirk's remains had finally been completed. The cause of death, previously suspected to be ligature strangulation, was now confirmed by deeper analysis: a fractured hyoid bone, anterior neck bruising, and petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, all signs of sustained pressure to the throat prior to death. But it wasn't the compression injury itself that raised eyebrows. It was the timeline of when it happened. According to Dr. Elaine Hart, the medical examiner, the pattern of decomposition around Jesse's nasal passages and oral cavity relative to the heat damage across her chest and limbs indicated that she was not yet deceased when the fire started. Based on soot particles found in the trachea and upper bronchi, Jesse had inhaled smoke before death. That detail mattered. It made a legal distinction between post-mortem concealment and an intentional act of murder by fire. Her death was not instant. The fire, like the restraint, was part of the plan, but perhaps not the plan she was supposed to survive into. The gaps grew clearer with time. Though Barber had covered transportation, physical control, and cleanup, he'd misjudged the realities of human variables. Jesse's last breath, the timeline of tissue damage, the lack of full decomposition where he expected incineration. Fire doesn't destroy DNA as completely as people think, especially not outdoors, and not when rushed. More importantly, the notebook made no mention of one crucial layer: digital silence. Barber had written, "Disable mobile, do not bring to sight." But Jesse's phone was left behind, powered on, fully charged, sitting in her apartment. When investigators cross-referenced her call log with the neighborhood tower pings, they noticed something Barber hadn't accounted for: Her Alexa-enabled smart speaker had been activated by voice at 7:55 a.m. on the day of the crime. A voice, female, weak, said, "Alexa, call Emily." The call didn't go through. There was no Wi-Fi connection, but the timestamp aligned within minutes of the suspect's arrival window. Investigators couldn't confirm if the voice was Jesse's. They couldn't pull audio, only metadata. But it created a wedge in Barber's timeline. He had planned for no witnesses, no camera, no physical contact. But technology had recorded a presence and a moment of fear. Further digital tracking showed Barber's phone had been turned off from 7:47 a.m. to 11:02 a.m. on March 4th. But metadata from a fitness app on his smartwatch, which hadn't been disabled, logged motion spikes between 8:12 and 8:46 a.m., consistent with moderate lifting and walking. The data placed him on foot near the wooded area north of Hallover Canal, just minutes from where Jesse's body would later be found. Barber had planned to erase his trail, but like many offenders, he underestimated how deeply modern devices monitor us, even when we're not paying attention. At this stage of the investigation, the evidence wasn't just forensic, it was behavioral. The way he wrote instructions, the way he avoided contact, the clinical tone. These weren't the actions of someone acting out of passion. They were actions stripped of empathy, structured but not flawless. Cases like Jesse Kirk's often fall apart on details, but here, it was the suspect's belief in his own precision that ultimately exposed him. His failure to understand the limits of his own control became the very thing that unraveled the image of mastery he'd tried so hard to build. And in communities like Titusville, where most people still leave their doors unlocked and know their neighbors by name, violence like this doesn't just take a life. It violates a sense of shared trust that takes years to rebuild. By mid-March 2025, the forensic investigation into Jesse Kirk's murder had reached operational maturity. The physical evidence had been compiled, the timeline reconstructed, and charges formally filed. But outside the airtight walls of the case file, the effects of the crime were only beginning to ripple outward, through family, community, and courtroom. Titusville wasn't used to press vans parked near retirement condos. It wasn't used to national headlines that involved phrases like targeted abduction or incineration, but the coverage was unavoidable. Once the arrest affidavit and forensic checklist were released to the public record, regional news outlets ran full features. Cold, calculated checklist. The phrase stuck. Local response was immediate and emotional. Memorials went up around the Palmetto Arms complex. Neighbors left candles and sunflowers, Jesse's favorite, on the concrete steps leading to her door. The building manager removed her name from the directory, but for weeks, handwritten signs replaced it. "We remember you." Public reaction carried weight in the legal narrative. Prosecutors knew the profile of the victim mattered in front of a jury. Jessie wasn't anonymous. She was embedded in the day-to-day lives of the same people who might eventually be called to serve. But emotion doesn't win trials. Evidence does. And the next phase of the process, pretrial preparation, demanded a shift from fieldwork to strategy. The Ninth Circuit State Attorney's Office convened a forensic debrief on March 15th. The goal? Identify vulnerabilities before the defense could exploit them. High on the list was intent. Though the manifesto outlined planning, the prosecution would need to establish motive, not speculation, but a traceable line between resentment and murder. Investigators revisited prior contacts between David Barber and the Kirk family. Beyond the restraining order, records now showed he had sent multiple anonymous letters post-breakup, some of which contained indirect threats. One, dated October 2024, read, "You don't get to dictate who matters to her. No name, no return address," but handwriting matched the checklist. On March 18th, the state filed a notice of intent to seek the death penalty. Florida law permits this when aggravating factors are present, and in this case, prosecutors argued 3. The homicide was committed during the course of a kidnapping. It was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. It was committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner. Barber's defense team responded by filing a motion to suppress the checklist, arguing it was seized without valid chain of custody procedures. The court denied the motion after confirming the warrant's scope and timeline. Meanwhile, a court-ordered psychological evaluation of Barber began behind closed doors. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case found him oriented, lucid, and aware of legal proceedings. No indicators of psychosis, no history of clinical mental illness. A diagnosis of narcissistic traits was noted, but did not meet threshold for insanity defense. This was not a man unaware of what he was doing. He understood the weight of consequence. He had, in fact, written steps to avoid it. A grand jury convened on March 25th. Within 4 hours, they returned an indictment on all primary charges. Barber was formally arraigned the following week. His plea, not guilty. Outside the courtroom, Jesse's family made their first and only public statement. It was brief and unrehearsed. We're not interested in revenge. We're interested in truth. That sentiment echoed across the investigation. Because cases like this aren't just about what was done. They're about how it was allowed to happen. And the truth is, warning signs had been present, documented, ignored, and dismissed as nonviolent. The restraining order wasn't enough. The prior stalking reports hadn't led to arrest. The GPS movements, the emotional fixation, the tactical mindset, it had all been visible, just never connected. And now, Titusville had a name in national rotation not because of a headline-making crime, but because it forced a conversation few communities are prepared to have: how to intervene before obsession turns lethal. As spring 2025 progressed, the Jesse Kirk murder case entered its most technical phase, trial preparation. By early April, the evidence had been fully cataloged, and the focus had shifted from collection to presentation. Prosecutors weren't just constructing a case, they were shaping a narrative, one the jury would need to follow without confusion or emotional fatigue. At the core was sequencing. Prosecutors had to decide what would land first: the checklist, the autopsy findings, or the surveillance footage. Each piece told part of the story, but alone, none of them proved intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The goal was cohesion: build the timeline from the inside out, layer by layer, without letting the structure collapse under complexity. Jury selection was scheduled to begin in May. Defense counsel had signaled they would pursue a mitigation strategy, not an innocence claim. That shaped how the prosecution approached witness selection. They narrowed their list to forensic specialists, behavioral experts, and 3 people from Jesse's inner circle. Not to generate sympathy, but to confirm routine. Routine would prove premeditation. The more predictable Jesse's movements, the more calculated the disruption of them appeared. One of the first confirmed expert witnesses was Dr. Elaine Hart, the medical examiner. She would testify not just to cause of death, but to the sequence: restrained first, strangled, possibly unconscious but not dead at the time of ignition. She would walk the jury through soot inhalation patterns and thermal damage timelines, linking forensic physiology to timestamps already confirmed by GPS and surveillance. The second key witness was a digital forensics analyst. They would testify on Barber's search history, metadata, and smartwatch motion data. Their job wasn't interpretation, it was precision. They would simply lay out what the devices recorded and when: motion at Hull over Canal, Google searches for restraint techniques, deleted draft emails addressed to Jesse's niece, all within days or hours of the crime. Then there was the checklist. The prosecution knew that presenting the list too early could backfire, either overwhelm the jury or desensitize them to its coldness. Instead, it would be introduced midway through trial, after the jury had already seen its steps play out organically. Surveillance, transport, cleanup, fire. By the time jurors saw the physical notebook, they would recognize the order, because they'd already followed it. The defense prepared a counter-strategy centered on overreach. They would argue that the state was using Barber's personality against him, that the list was a reflection of obsession, not intent. Their psychologists would point to military-style language as indicative of fixation, not planning. They would lean heavily on absence of motive, asserting that no known conflict with Jesse existed beyond vague relational ties. Prosecutors anticipated this and took steps to neutralize it early. They obtained supplemental communications from Barber's past relationships unrelated to the Kirk family, highlighting a pattern of possessiveness, boundary violations, and use of planning language under emotional stress. None of it directly proved guilt, but it suggested pattern, which courts allow under specific evidentiary rules. This was the phase where trial law met psychology, not just what was shown, but how and in what order. Jesse's family had made clear they wouldn't speak to the media again, but they were present at every hearing, unflinching. The prosecution took note of their posture, quiet but steady, and decided not to call them as witnesses. They would remain visible to the jury, but not vocal. There's a reason jury trials aren't about emotion. Emotion fades. Precision doesn't. In criminal court, the weight of evidence has to outlast the room it's spoken in. And with a case like this, one built on timing, silence, and control, the most dangerous thing wasn't what was said. It was what the jury would realize had been done, without a single sound. The trial of Michael O'Keefe Jr., accused of murdering his girlfriend Jillian Schreiner, opened in May 2025 in Volusia County. The prosecution's case was built on physical evidence, digital data, and a consistent timeline. Jillian's body, discovered in her car behind a storage unit in DeLand, showed signs of asphyxiation. The autopsy confirmed she died on July 27, 2024, the same day O'Keefe claimed she vanished. The most damning evidence came from Jillian's iPhone. Although damaged, data was recovered showing her phone had stopped moving that evening and remained at the storage location. Text messages recovered from days before her death revealed rising fear. Jillian wrote she felt unsafe. Friends and coworkers testified she had grown withdrawn, and several noted O'Keefe's controlling behavior. O'Keefe told police Jillian left after an argument and never returned. He gave multiple versions of her supposed departure, none verifiable. No lift was called. No beach trip happened. Surveillance footage contradicted his story. A man matching his build parked her car at the storage site late that night and walked away. The defense argued circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. But prosecutors pointed to patterns, control, lies, and disposal of the body as a calculated cover-up. The trial remains ongoing as of July 11, 2025. A verdict is expected later this summer, though legal motions have delayed sentencing. Jillian's family sat through every day of the trial. Her mother, Amanda, quietly advocated for stronger recognition of coercive control. She was trying to leave, she said, but she didn't get the chance. This case is a reminder that abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes the danger is subtle, invisible, until it's too late. Justice may come in court, but awareness must come earlier. I've walked you through every detail of this case, not just as a storyteller, but as someone who believes every voice silenced too soon deserves to be heard. Jillian Schreiner's life was taken by someone she once trusted. And if there's one thing I've learned from her story, it's this. Control doesn't always look like violence, and love should never feel like fear. If you're watching this and something feels wrong in your life, don't wait. Speak up. Get help. You matter more than you know. What do you think we as a community can do better to protect each other? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, share where you're from, or even just let me know what this story meant to you. And hey, if this video struck a chord or made you feel something real, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your voice, your presence matters here. See you in the next story.